Hi, I'm Rainer. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some old cameras. Specifically, going to talk about these three cameras. This is a Cantina Zeiss Icon camera from the early 60s. It has a 45mm color Pantar Zeiss lens on it. It is a fully manual camera, nothing automatic on it. The next camera I'm going to talk about is this one. It is a Ricoh. It is an SLR camera, currently with a Pentax 135mm lens on it. Again, fully manual camera. It does have a built-in light meter and through the lens focusing, things like that. The third camera I'm going to talk about is this Nikon Zoom Touch 400, and it has a 35 to 70mm macro lens on it, fully automatic, point and shoot, easy to use. So what is the significance of these three cameras? They're from different decades. This one's built in the early 60s. This one is from the early 80s, I would say. Can't remember. This is from the early 90s. One thing they all have in common, they use 35mm film. Why am I talking about this? I had a conversation with a guy I was working with a few weeks ago, and we were doing a audio and video setup for a wedding. It was in a break in between all the lockdowns here, and we were actually allowed to do some weddings, small ones, but I was doing the white balance on the three video cameras we were using for a live stream, and we got to talking about cameras, and he mentioned that he would like to buy a camera sometime to start taking pictures. And so we talked about it a little bit more, and I realized that the only thing he's ever used for photography is a phone, and that makes sense. He's about half my age. He's in his early 20s. When I talked to him a bit more, I realized he had dreams of buying a film camera, which is great, no problem. But when I talked to him a bit more about it, I realized he really didn't know anything about cameras or what to look for. I made the suggestion he should probably start with, if he wants film, to start with a 35mm camera, that there's a lot of them on eBay. So he pulled out his phone and started searching on eBay for 35mm cameras, and he started coming up with things like a Pentax K1000 with a 50mm lens, and it seemed that the lens measurements, a 50mm lens or a 28mm lens or whatever, caused a little bit of confusion because he was looking at a 35mm camera, and I realized that maybe it wasn't all that clear what the 35mm meant as well. And then a few days later, I was walking around again. Like I said, there was a bit of a lifting of restrictions, of the pandemic restrictions around here. And I was walking around an antique market with my wife, and I noticed a lot of used cameras there, old ones. And a lot of them were 35mm cameras. I also realized that for most of the cameras, assuming it was still a functional camera and I had film to fit it, and I had a battery if it needed a battery, I could probably pick up any of those cameras and be taking pictures with it very quickly. So why do I have that advantage over them? It's very simple. It's these three cameras that I showed you. This camera is my dad's camera. He bought it brand new in the early 60s when he was in Sweden, brought it back to Canada. This is the camera I learned to take pictures with. It's a fully manual camera. I even have the original owner's manual for it. Too bad I don't read Swedish. But this camera doesn't have a light meter in it. It doesn't have through the lens focusing. You need to use a separate light meter to set the exposure. It's about as simple as a 35mm camera gets. And I think it's a great learning tool, and it does take great pictures. This is a 35mm Ricoh SLR camera that my parents got me when I was in high school. Came with a 50mm lens, and since then I have a bunch of other lenses for it that all fit. Currently has a Pentax 135mm lens on it. It has through the lens focusing like every SLR has, It has a built-in light meter, but that's about it. It's still a fully manual camera. Great tool to learn with. This camera is a fully automatic Nikon point-and-shoot camera. Shoots 35mm film. I bought it for my wife. I think it was in the early 90s. Takes great pictures, but completely different to use than those other ones, but uses the same film. So after having some conversations with people and seeing all these used cameras at the antique market, and with the increased interest that I've seen online of people getting into shooting with film cameras, I thought it would be a good idea to see if I can create a series of videos that covers the basics of using a film camera, specifically 35mm film cameras, because I have a few of them here, and that's what I've always used. I'm going to try to cover the absolute basics in my descriptions and my instructions. I want these videos to be helpful to people who have maybe never picked up a camera before and don't know the basics and don't even know the terminology that some of us could take for granted. My approach to understanding how to use some piece of equipment usually involves me trying to figure out how that equipment works, because it helps me understand how to use it better. So that's where I'll start, starting with the basics. So basic film cameras like these guys are actually fairly simple pieces of equipment. Yes, they contain some amazing craftsmanship and complex mechanisms inside, but the basic functions when it comes to using them are pretty simple. On either one of these cameras, there are essentially three functions or three controls that you need to control to take a picture. They are the aperture, the shutter speed, and the focus. So the first thing to talk about is shutter speed, and I have this Ricoh 35mm SLR. This one doesn't have any film in it, so I'll use that. The shutter is very simply the thing that opens when you push the button. It opens and closes at a predetermined speed or for a predetermined amount of time. And so on this camera, it goes everything from 1/8 of a second to 1/500th of a second. And what I will do is initially I will just show you on B, so where I can hold the shutter open with the button. And when you load film into it, the roll of film goes on this side, feeds across, and then rolls onto this side as you take pictures. And basically, when you're taking a picture, the film is in front of here. And when you push the shutter opens like this and then closes. That exposes the film. So that was at just B, that's me controlling it. But if I put it at 1/8 of a second, hopefully you'll be able to see it open and close. If I put it at 60th of a second, it's much faster. If I put it 1/500th of a second, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. Probably not, because it was so fast. What the shutter does on a camera is it exposes the film for a certain amount of time. The other thing that you control is the aperture. And a camera lens, just like our eye, in our pupil of our eye, we have the iris in there that opens and closes depending on the amount of light to adjust for the light. And a camera lens has the same thing. There's a diaphragm in there, and there's, on older manual lenses, there is a dial on the outside that you turn to adjust the size of the opening, the aperture in the lens, and that's referred to as the f-stop. If you look through this lens, you can see right now the diaphragm is wide open, the aperture is wide open. As I turn this dial, it gets smaller. So on this camera, the smallest aperture setting, the smallest hole, is referred to as f16. The largest opening on this thing is referred to as f2.2. So sometimes you'll hear people talking about the speed of the lens. What they're actually referring to is the widest aperture available on the lens. How much light can it let in? A faster lens lets in more light. That's really all they're talking about. When you're setting the aperture and the shutter speed on a camera, what you're trying to do is get the proper exposure for the film. And exposure is very simply having the right amount of light hit the film for the right amount of time. If you get a picture that's slightly overexposed, what you'll notice is the bright areas of the picture, the sky, lights, lighter colored areas will start to get blown out. They will just be white and there won't be any detail left in them. If it's completely overexposed, your whole picture is just white. If you have an underexposed picture, you will start to have the lighter areas will start to look a little bit dark, but in the biggest problem will be in the shadows. You won't get any information. Everything will just look kind of black. There's no detail in the shadows. The darker areas will just kind of lose any definition. If it's completely underexposed, the whole picture will essentially be black. Now, let's go to talking about film. This is a 35 millimeter roll of film. What does the 35 millimeters refer to? It refers to the width of the film this way. It's a 35 millimeter film. Any camera that takes 35 millimeter film, it just means that the camera accepts film this size. The actual image that it takes is a rectangle on the film. It's 36 millimeters this way and 24 millimeters this way. The 35 just refers to the film width. The way this works is when you buy the film, it comes out with a bit of the film sticking out of the canister. Don't pull the rest out, because anything you pull out and expose to light is now immediately completely overexposed because it's not protected. The canister keeps light from getting onto the film itself. When you buy a roll of film, it will come with either, the common sizes are either 36 exposure or 24 exposure film. There is enough length of film inside the canister to fit either 24 rectangles on it or 36 rectangles on it. If you're careful, you can usually get 2 or 3 extra, but that's what they're meant for. I won't talk about other film sizes. There's lots of other sizes available. 35 millimeter is the most common. As a result, it's probably the most affordable film to get into. There's lots of cameras available on the used market for very affordable prices, and it's a good starting point. When you talk about film itself, there are 3 common types of film that have been available. The oldest would have been black and white negative film. It's a film that is used to create black and white prints. The reason it's called a negative is that when you look at how the image looks on the actual roll of film once it's processed, the black and the white are reversed. So black is white, white is black, but then when you print it, everything is corrected. That's the oldest style. It was the simplest to make, and it was the simplest to process. Color really got popular, started to become popular in 35 millimeter film in the 30s with the introduction of Kodachrome color positive or slide film. And Kodachrome film was in production and in use from the 30s all the way up to 2009, and the last roll of it was processed in 2010. And this is a slide I have from, I believe, in the 80s. Does it have a year on it? No. It's from the 80s, made with Kodachrome film. The reason I have this one just floating around is because it is actually black all the way through, because I completely underexposed the picture. But when you get it processed, they just process the whole film, whether the image works or not. So Kodachrome film was a color positive film, so the colors were actually captured onto the film itself and generally were viewed with a projector. If you wanted, you can get prints out of it. It was very popular for a long time. Most professional photographers liked it because it had very good color rendition, vibrant colors, and it just looked really nice. After color positive came along, then you came out with color negative film, which is the most common film that you would buy now. It is like black and white. Things are reversed. The colors are reversed. So red looks green, green looks red, etc. around a color wheel, if you want to imagine it that way. So when you look at the film after it's processed, all the colors look backwards. Again, when it's printed, the prints come out the right way around. So this is a roll of Kodak, an expired roll of Kodak Gold 100 ISO film that I found sitting loaded in one of my cameras. Nothing had been taken on it, so I'm not even going to worry about it. That's why I don't have a problem handling it like this, because it's not a film I'm going to use for anything. So this side of the film is covered with light-sensitive particles. They are protected from light inside this canister. When it's in the camera, every time you advance the film and then take a picture, that rectangle on the film is now exposed to light and it captures the image. But after you take the picture, the film needs to be protected completely in the dark until it's processed. Otherwise, the image will be ruined and it will just be completely overexposed. The light-sensitive particles on here are very small. And when you look at the number on here, it says that the ISO, that is the sensitivity of the film. The higher the number, the more sensitive the film is to light, the better that film will work in a poorly lit situation. So 100 ISO film like this is not a very fast or light sensitive film. It is a very much finer grained film than some other films. The light sensitive particles that are on the film, the smaller the particles are, the more you can fit on a film. The problem is that the smaller the particles are, the less sensitive they are to light. So to create a more sensitive film, you need to use larger particles on it, which means you fit less of them on the film. So if you use a high-speed film like an ISO 800 and take pictures with that, it will work in much lower light situations than an ISO 100 film. But when you look at the picture very closely on an ISO 800 film, you'll be able to see the grain. You'll actually be able to see the light-sensitive particles on it, whereas with an ISO 100 film, it's a much finer film and you'll get sharper images as long as you have enough light. So the ISO of the film matters because it will dictate what type of aperture and shutter speeds you can use that film with in any given lighting situation. As far as loading the film into the camera, with every camera there's really a button here, or there's different ways of opening it. On this camera, you pull up the rewind spool, the back opens. What you do then is the film canister just fits into here, and then you pull out just enough film to tuck it into a slot on the rewind spool. So you'll see I've tucked it into a slot on here, and then you just start to wind this. And once you get the film started and you know it's hooked on, you don't want to do too much. You don't want to pull it on too far. You just go in here and you pull it a little bit until you get snug, and then you close the door, push this, and on this camera you can see, if you look at this spool, you'll see this side turns as I pull the winding lever. So what you do is you take a couple of pictures. And the reason I took a couple of pictures like that is to get the camera ready, because when you're winding it on, the film that's sitting in front of the shutter plus a little bit on this side has already been exposed to light, so it's no good for taking pictures. So what you want to do is push the button, wind it, push the button again to make sure you have fresh film in front of the shutter so you're ready to take a picture. This camera has a small counter right here that shows you how many pictures you've taken. So it's not even at 1 yet, because it is allowing for the fact that I need to do a couple of shots to even get the camera loaded up. So now at this point, the camera is ready to take pictures, except for one little detail. And what you would need to do on this camera to calibrate the internal lighting meter is there is a dial on here that you would need to turn to, in the case of this film, to ISO 100. And now, assuming the battery is fresh in this, which it probably isn't in this case, this camera would be ready with the lens on it to be able to take pictures. So now this camera is loaded with film, and depending on the type of film you put in, either 24 or 36 exposure film, you are really stuck with whatever ISO film you put in here until you used up the whole roll, unless you want to waste some of the roll. So if you go through and take pictures with the camera, once you hit the end of the roll, you'll notice that as you're winding this, sometimes all of a sudden it'll stop and it won't go all the way. And on this camera, to turn the camera on light meter, you pull it out. And if you notice the arm's doing something funny, it's probably because you hit the end of the roll and you weren't able to fully wind it. If you can go all the way like that and then push the button, there's still film. But if you find that you suddenly hit the end, don't force it. Stop. You've hit the end of the roll. Don't try to force it. You're not getting more out. All you can do is break the film. That you don't want to do that. Now, whatever you do when you hit the end of the film, don't open the back of the door right away. If you do that, you've ruined your film, probably all the pictures you took on it. What you need to do first is wind the film back into the canister so it's protected in the canister before you take it out of the camera. And the way you do it on this camera is there's a little button on the bottom to release it. And then you flip this crank over and you turn. And you turn it and you can feel when the film releases inside. Now I can open it and the film is fully wound inside the canister. And now you take it in to get it processed. Usually if you're out, you have a second film, I normally would take this out. I would try to do it. It doesn't need to be done completely in the dark, but it's a good idea to do it somewhere where it's somewhat more subdued light at least. Take this out, load your new film in, close it up, and then you're ready to go. So that's the basic function of a 35mm camera. So you essentially have 3 settings that you need to deal with when you're taking a picture, and those are the aperture and the shutter speed, and those are dependent on the light that you have where you're taking the picture and on the ISO of your film that you have loaded in the camera. Beyond that, the only other adjustment is the focus, and depending on your camera, sometimes that's done by looking through the camera and making sure everything is in focus, or on some cameras like my old camera of my dad's, you have to guess the distance, dial it into the lens, and that's how you set the focus. Anyway, hopefully this is helpful to somebody. And, you know, if you're the kind of person that knows all the stuff about cameras, this video is not for you. This is for those people that are looking for the absolute basics and just want to know how to get going with the film camera. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. And in the next video, I'm going to show the actual function of that old Contina camera, how you take pictures with it, how you use a separate exposure meter, and hopefully that will help somebody as well. Anyway, thanks for joining me.